Write down margin. Margin. The authors of this book I'm referring to say the second biggest obstacle to loving our neighbor is lacking any room in our lives to actually get involved in theirs. Margin just refers to that part of your budget or that part of your calendar that is not as filled up, that there's room in there to respond to a person who is genuinely in need. This guy says, read the parable of the Good Samaritan from the perspective of margin. It's very likely that the priest and the Levite had the desire to stop. They just didn't have the ability to stop. They had so much important stuff they had to do, they didn't have space for the things that God was putting in their lives that they needed to do. And what I'm telling you is, for some of you, the problem is not here. You really do, your problem is, I guess, here. This right here, this calendar is so filled up with things that there simply is no way to respond either financially or with your time when God puts somebody in your life that he wants you to minister to. Let me tell you, I love this. This is a wonderful teaching. I'd never heard this before. I learned this recently, and you might not have heard this either. Leviticus 19 is where God gives the command to love your neighbor as yourself. Leviticus 19. How many of you have that passage memorized? Okay, not me either. Well, right after he gives that command, in Leviticus 19, he gives the most random law that seems to just like go off a different direction, but it totally is how you're supposed to love your neighbor. Watch this, and you'll see how it applies to the Good Samaritan. Right after he gives the command to love God or love your neighbor as yourself, he says, now you farmers, when you glean the harvest from your farm, I want you to leave the corners of your field ungleaned. That's rule number one. And rule number two is whatever you drop while you're gleaning, you can't pick it up. Which means if you're an apple, farm, you got apple trees, you can pull the apples off all the trees, except for the ones in the corner, you can't touch them. And if you drop an apple while you're picking one up, you got to leave it on the ground. Now, why would you do that? Because when the poor come along, the poor are going to be the ones who get the apples off the corner of the tree, and they're the ones who pick up the apples off the ground. You know what that's called? Margin. That's what that's called. Because a good businessman says, every last apple I am going to take and purpose for the business. And God says, nope, not in my kingdom. In my kingdom, you're going to leave margin so that when I bring a poor person into your life, you got something to give to them. What that means and how we apply it to this is that we need to ruthlessly think about the schedule and the budget that we have set up and ask if we have left the corners ungleaned and if we've left sitting on the ground what we have dropped. Because for many of us, the problem is not a problem of desire. The problem is a problem of we simply have no room in our budget or our schedule to respond to the opportunities that God puts into our lives, which means this is what you got to do. Some of you, we need to audit our lives. We're going to give you a tool here in the next couple of weeks called a margin auditing tool. We're going to use it in our small groups. I'll make it available on my blog too. And it's just going to ask you some honest questions so that you can look at your life and figure out how you're spending your life and if you've got the margin to be able to be involved in the things that God has for you that are the most important. We're going to teach you a phrase, simplify and invest. Simplify means that you're going to need to cut out some things in your life, and then the ones you choose to keep, you're going to invest more deeply in them because that's a much better way to live. Simplify and invest. A margin auditing tool. All right? Simplify and invest. The reason I'm impressed this is because you're never going to live the life that God intends until you intend to. It's not nodding your head in the sermon. It's actually looking at your schedule and your budget saying, have I got it set up the way that I need to have it set up? You'll never live the life that God intends for you until you intend to. And then the flip side of that is after you audit, you're going to have to learn how to say no. You have to learn no is the greatest word for mission. You'll never be able to say yes to mission until you say no to some really good things in your life. I don't mean bad things, I mean good things. The most important principle I've ever learned about time management is this, that I cannot say yes to something without automatically saying no to something else. And I'm a type A people pleaser, which means I like to say yes to everybody about everything. And I had to realize that in saying yes to this, I was actually saying no to some things that I really, really needed to focus on. And so you're going to have to learn to say no to some good things to make room for the essential things.